You're listening to the Saving Elephants podcast, a place where millennials express and defend their conservative values in hopes of restoring the Republican Party. Join us as we reignite conservatism for millennials.
Much ado is made these days about alternatives to the sort of classical conservatism or fusionist conservatism I advocate here at Saving Elephants. These alternatives go by many names, of course: the alt-right, the dissident right, the new right, the post-liberals, the nationalist conservatives. And it's not that they all believe the same thing, but there is a sense in which these groups are ascendant. An unyielding force that cannot be stopped, and an inevitability that will eventually take over all of the conservative movement and reform it in this new image. Well, I think this is wrong on two counts. First of all, I don't think it's inevitable. I don't think it's going to win. But second, I don't think it's that new. The post-liberals, those who are critical of the American founding principles found in the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the Declaration, are channeling views and voices that are actually quite old. And much like it's commonplace on the right to make fun of, say, socialism, and to point out that everywhere socialism has been tried, it has failed, it turns out everywhere post-liberalism has been tried, it has also failed. At least that's the conclusion in the new book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed, by James Patterson and Thomas Howes, and I am definitely inclined to agree with them. And I'm happy to have not just one, but both of them on in this episode, to talk about the insanely conspiratorial history of post-liberalism, where it came from, why it's ascendant today, where it might be going, and what we fusionist classical conservatives might do to counteract it. So with that, I give you my conversation with James Patterson and Thomas Howes.
You're listening to the Saving Elephants Show.
Well, it's good to welcome not one but two guests, kind of an unusual feat here at Saving Elephants, but both of you have just written a wonderful book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed, a not-so-subtle knock on Patrick Deneen's Why Liberalism Failed, of course. And I got to
say,
what's that?
What are you trying to say? You're not that original?
Well, yeah, we'll get into that, Deneen, here in a moment. I got to say, I'm a Protestant, but I really am enjoying this book. I think because it's so deliciously gossipy and doesn't pull any punches, more than I'm expecting. But for the sake of the listener who's not watching us, I'll introduce you individually. We have Thomas Howes with us. Thomas, you've been on a live stream panel for Saving Elephants before, but it's been a while. But it's good to have you back on.
Right. Nice to be back.
Yeah, been quite a bit. I've been trying to get both of you guys on forever now, and you finally wrote a whole book, so I was able to capture you for this moment. And then, of course, join us for the first time, James Patterson. James, I didn't know as much about you. I looked you up on Wikipedia, and I was actually surprised to learn that apparently you've sold 425 million copies of books, and the first person to reach 1 million in ebooks. So it's quite an honor to have you with us, sir.
That's right. I've more famous than even my co-author Bill Clinton.
Fair enough.
Different James Patterson.
Yes. No. Yeah. If in case the
I tell every publisher they should make it look like one of his whenever they publish a book of mine.
Just incidentally, is that why you went by James M. Patterson?
Yes.
Okay. Not to be confused with. Yeah.
He had a book that came out called The Noise, and if you were one of the first 100 people to pre-order it and then submit evidence of pre-order to a website, you could get a pair of James Patterson branded headphones. And so I did that. And so I have headphones with my own name on it now.
Oh, that's
terrible.
Cool. They're terrible.
Really cool.
You're not wearing them currently, are you?
No,
Okay.
no, they're extremely low quality. I think he found them in the dumpster in the streets of Taiwan or something. I don't know where he found these, but I still own them.
There is a cardboard cutout. I'm not sure if it's life size or not. If so, Patterson is a very short dude. A cardboard cutout of James Patterson at the local used bookstore here in the greater Tulsa area, Garner's Books. And I don't know if I have much more to say about that other than it's just, I don't know. He's definitely broken through. He's one of those, like Stephen King, one of those authors that's become a household name.
Yeah. The Thomas Kincaid of mystery novels.
Exactly. Well, So we'll get back on your book here. I have lots of questions, lots of thoughts, lots of threads to pull on. We should probably do a little bit of level setting with the traditional what is post-liberalism, and I want to ask this in way of asking you guys. Look, I get that the book is written for a Catholic audience, those captured by sort of the Catholic integralists' ideas of post-liberalism, but when I just hear the term post-liberal, shorn of say this book or this discussion, I would not just equate it with the Catholic take, if you will. Certainly, your Doug Wilsons, who are advocating a Christian nationalism, I don't get the sense that he is saying we swear allegiance to the Pope. And I dare say there's probably a lot of people that would be comfortable with a post-liberal label that don't even have any sort of a Christian or religious bent to it at all, but have some sort of other direction that they have in mind. So I guess my first we'll web these together as the same as a two-parter question. What is post-liberalism, and why collapse it down to just focus on the Catholic aspect of it?
That's an artifact, to answer the second question, that's an artifact of the rapidly developing use of the term. When Tom and I proposed the book to Acton Institute for writing, really the only people that were calling themselves consistently post-liberals were two groups. One was a group of primarily Protestant or Anglican theologians, who we say we're not talking about pretty early in the book, and the other is an effort to rebrand Catholic integralism, and so Catholic integralism becomes post-liberalism as a way of kind of dealing with the term becoming very unpopular or at least controversial because of the publication of a book called Integralism, a Manual of Political Philosophy by Thomas Crean and Alan Phimister, which said things like, certain kinds of slavery are okay, and Jews and Muslims can't be citizens, and we should get rid of the right to vote for large numbers of people. And
It said the quiet parts out loud, it sounds like.
Yeah, that's exactly right. And it was because integralism was kind of having a little like boomlet in Catholic theological circles. People decided to kind of say the quiet part out loud. In fact, I was speaking with a friend of mine, and he was describing how Philip Pilkington, this sort of a second tier post-liberal, was convinced for a long time that Crean and Phimister wrote that book to undermine integralism. That was like a psyop. But no, unfortunately, though, those guys actually believed that stuff. They believed it for a long time. And as for what post-liberalism is, this is normally the question I answer when I get it. So like Tom and I kind of have questions that if we get, we know who's answering them. That's how like he knew to jump in here. so Tom, we'll hear from Tom. But I've been talking a long time. I feel kind of like sheepish about that. But so post-liberalism has three components. The first is a ideological component. The second is an institutional component. And the third is a political component. The ideological component is the idea that we need to remove representative government, constitutional governments, or any vestiges of republicanism they associate with liberalism in favor of an executive-led, administrative, or bureaucratic state that would be top-down in design. And rather than people presuming to have liberty where there is no limits, instead it would be that people are presumed to have limits unless there's explicit permission to do something. So it's a very authoritarian model that they have in mind here, bound up in a kind of stylized reading of Catholic political thought and heavy doses of reactionary and fascist political thought. So the institutional version of post-liberalism is that they have their own sort of groups that they hang out in to bring in people that are younger and kind of facilitate them into jobs, as well as form them into good little post-liberal adherents. And so this has happened over the years in places like the Intercollegiate Studies Institute Summer Honors Program. The leading post-liberals of Patrick Deneen, Adrian Vermeule, Gladden Papin, Chad Pecknold, they've all kind of like filtered through there in various capacities. But Pecknold and Deneen run that Summer Honors Program. Then there's Pro Civitate Dei, which is a Catholic sort of integralist summer camp in the French Pyrenees that Papin founded. Academia Tocqueville, Nathan Pekoski runs. He's another one of these post-liberals, although he's more like animated by Islam in France than anything. But they have these kinds of like youth camps, integralist youth, right? And And what this plays right into the third, the political strategy, which is that these groups, these networks, these younger workers or younger students will be sent into policy work. They'll become essentially like entry level elites. And it's now a process that's been going on for long enough that post liberals have been able to enter into even like mid level offices in the Trump White House. For example, the Department of State, a guy named Sam Sampson is very prominent there. Did a lot of stuff in Hungary until Orban left, and with Pecknold, and so it's it's already beginning to bear fruit. So people often, if they know anything about the Catholic variation of post liberalism, will think of it as kind of kooky, but it's actually already deploying a strategy for elite takeover of conservative politics in the United States. And it's pretty closely tied to these international sort of very far right parties like Vox in Spain and National Rally in France. So it's a long answer, but it's important because, as you said, post liberal is a term, it's pretty new and it's changing a lot of its meaning. So, sort of need to account for why ours is a little abbreviated.
And they like to employ, like a lot of radical groups, they like to employ a lot of Moat and Bailey tactics and other kind of tactics where, no, we're just saying X, which is some non-objectionable thing, and then you get to know it a little more, then the more objectionable stuff comes up, and then you call them out on it, and they say, well, no, 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 we're just, all it means is X, right? And that's, so
Right.
you really have to read between the lines a little bit, see who they're endorsing, what kind of movement they're making, all of that stuff. I mean, James and I have been watching this closely for a few years. They've even tried to, some of these people have tried to persuade us to join them, right? So it's we're very much. Sometimes outsiders can kind of fall for the attempts that they made to seem like they're not all that radical.
Well, so let me ask a question then about how concerning this is, because I think based on what both of you have just shared, the average person would be like, "Oh, that sounds bad. Obviously, I don't want that taking over." Presuming they hold a, let's say, I'll call it liberal. I'm going to call it liberty friendly view. um, but I can imagine that you hear the critique very often. Are we not talking about the terminally online, some just tiny pinprick of percentage of the population? Like, I even heard this a while back. I was asking a friend, I cannot remember off the top of my head who it was, but he was Catholic, asking, like, how much is Catholic integralism even discussed within Catholicism? He said, I don't think most Catholics even know what a Catholic integralist is. Granted, we're talking about a slightly different term here. Um, so help me get a sense of why should the average person care about this if seemingly it's such a niche pastime of a very small contingent of people.
All political movements that are successful are like that. They go from the top down. They're a small group that's highly networked, have highly connected. It's just like that's just how all these things. So that's how fascism started. That's how that's how communism started. That I mean that you should be you should be, and they're very cagey too and political. They say things like they're pretending in some of their people who carry water for them in the mainstream press, and I'm not going to name names, pretend that all post liberalism is this populist reaction to excessive immigration
Mm-hmm.
and globalism, and they'll say that, but that's not how the post liberals themselves think about it. But that's how they say, because that's the stuff that they know that they can get behind that's really popular. So they get behind these populist strongmen and hope that they can get there through these networks, get one of their people to have the power in that strongman position that they've created, right? And it blows up in their face 90% of the time, but you can do a lot of damage even though it blows up in your face, right? They were supportive of Trump. They're supporting of all the efforts to install loyalists in Washington, and some of that's blowing up in their face because Trump doesn't really want to play with them, right? And they don't have a lot of power within the administration. But then their hope is like, oh, but if we get Vance in, we actually know Vance, and once we've set the tone for him to be the sort of the strongman executive, then he can get things done. And they hope that, I mean, they were kind of had that with Viktor Orban in Hungary. They've joined the far right, international far right forces to push for people in Germany and France and other places where there are these far right populist groups. But their hope is to get a foot in there install their new elite and work by means of the bureaucracy or the administration so that they can gradually move the needle towards the things that they want to do. I don't think they're ever going to succeed. That's why we say post-liberalism failed, but doesn't mean you can't do a lot of damage in the process.
Right.
Another thing is, remember police abolition, getting rid of everyone's college student debt, 1619 Project. These are all examples from the left of very small movements of people that were through proximity to media and prestige to blow way beyond what you would think just a small number of people would be able to communicate. And that is the model that post liberals use. They actually don't want to be like a mass movement. They want to seize party elites so that it doesn't matter if you've never heard of Catholic integralism, you're going to be voting for it if you're going to vote for a Republican. So J.D. Vance is a post-liberal. Nobody voted for post-liberalism when they voted for Trump and Vance. Most people didn't, that is, but they got it.
Mm-hmm.
And you have to understand in the Catholic world, first of all, like hardcore Catholics punch way above our weight. We're just like, same thing with Mormons, the connected Mormons, same thing with, it's just, that's just if people who have strong networks at high levels can punch above their weight. Within the Catholic world, this is a war between Catholic elites, really, a sort of civil war between Catholic elites, because even the non-integralist Catholic elites punch above their weight. People like Robert George punches way above his weight, right? And the people connected with him, Leonard Leo, right? And now that's why you get all these like conspiracy theories about Jesuits and Opus Dei. And the fact is there's not a conspiracy. It's just they're really well networked groups. So they know people over here that they have influence over in the judiciary. They've got know people over here. They have influence in academia. Know people over here have influence in the federal government. So it's would you say that's right, James?
Yeah. So with Adrian, he's Adrian Vermeule is a chaired professor of constitutional law at Harvard Law School. Patrick Deneen is a chaired professor of political theory at University of Notre Dame. Until recently, I think technically still is, but on his way out was the president of the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, Gladden Papin. Chad Pecknold is a professor of theology at Catholic University of America, which is in Washington. So they've been leveraging these prestigious positions. In the case of Papin, it was also one that carried a fair amount of discretionary money that he could sort of distribute. And with Pecknold, he's also close to Washington, so he has access to Catholic communities there that influence staff.
He's really close to Kevin Roberts at Heritage Foundation.
Mm-hmm.
And J.D. Vance.
Yeah. And that kind of networking matters more than telling the average parishioner at St. Teresa's on an 11 o'clock mass about why you need to obey Boniface VIII's Unum Sanctum and consider America under the universal suzerainty of the Catholic Church. They don't care about that guy, right? That guy doesn't matter. He'll vote for Vance when the time comes.
So let's talk about Vance in a moment. And by the way, this is why I like the book. There's so many names here that I'm a nerd that swims in this sea, and it's nice to kind of hear some of the behind the scenes things.
It's a history and a gossip magazine.
Yes, it is. Vance is a practicing Catholic, from all appearances, a sincerely practicing Catholic. If we're sort of comparing, let's say, the game plan or possible, I won't say the game plan, I'm going to say possible strategies or outlets for the post-liberal to assume power in the United States, it would seem to me that J.D. Vance is the closest thing currently that's on offer, potentially. And if so, I'm wondering, like, would he be seen among the true believers of the post-liberal movement as sort of a Viktor Orban of someone who himself, while maybe a believer, is not necessarily the literally religious leader we're looking to, but he's someone we can play ball with? Or does Vance see himself as trying to play this role? Or is he more just a useful kind of Viktor Orban, who, from what I understand, Orban was never super religious, but a lot of the religious in Hungary were like, well, yeah, but we can work with the guy.
Yeah, I mean, I think J.D. Vance is a sincere Catholic, but I also think as a young convert, a lot of times this happens with converts, they get into this contrarian mentality because they were surprised that the church had a lot of true things to say. So then they start taking other anti-establishment things very seriously, and they go down these rabbit holes. And I think there's as Susie Wiles said, that he's a conspiracy theorist. I believe her. I mean, he obviously takes seriously people like Tucker Carlson and Peter Thiel, who say a lot of wonky things, right? And Curtis Yarvin, and what's this other podcaster he likes now? One guy I can't remember. And I mean, he has no animus towards Jews, or even doesn't seem to care about Jewish conspiracy theories. So that's good.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
he also kind of is naively just accepts their account that they don't really hate Jews. They're just mad at Israel. And anybody who knows how anti-Semitism works, that's very naive, right? These people have this view of the Jews as they're constantly under suspicion, and they're a perfect scapegoat for all the problems. And they people. I mean, it's what Vance did with the Haitians in Springfield. He doesn't do as much with the whatever, but that same idea of using them as a scapegoat for all the problems. Most of the anti-Semites are like that. They don't actually explicitly hate Jews. They don't. You're like, oh, I know Jewish people. I'm friends with them. Whatever. I just don't like this conspiracy to destroy everything.
Right.
And Vance is very naive about that, and he carries water for a lot of these anti-Semites, even though he's not an anti-Semite. I don't think. I'll give him the benefit of the doubt.
2023, Vance was one of 3 panelists with Patrick Deneen with the publication of Regime Change, Deneen's book from then. And at that event, he called himself a post-liberal, and he's never revoked that title for himself. There are lots of pictures of him with Pecknold and Vance. I'm sorry, and Deneen. Vance went to Hungary to campaign for Orban at the last minute.
Yeah.
Had that very uncomfortable conversation, point where he had the phone. He was playing Trump into that, but Trump sent him to voicemail first. Right. I'm not sure if you remember this, but so there was he was there for many days trying to do this. And, of course, Orban came to the United States, actually visited the White House, and at that visit, Papin is in the foreground. So this stuff has pretty well integrated into the Vance office. So I would say that unless we're given some direct reason for all of this to go away or to be purged, Vance makes a public statement saying that he's a huge George Weigel fan now and wants to do Christian democracy.
Well, he had a random shot at George Weigel in his recent book, so I don't.
He did. Oh my gosh!
Yeah.
I have to admit that I I'm so burnt out on this stuff that I've been taking a bit of a break from it, and I'm not at all surprised. I haven't read Communion, so I'm not at all surprised to hear him say that.
Yeah, I wrote a review that's supposed to be coming out for Civitas sometime soon on it. I think you'll think I was very charitable, James.
Yeah, I'm the bad cop. Tom's always been the good cop.
Well, that means I know which sections of the book you wrote.
Yeah. Whenever I think there's a line in which I'm talking about this French critic of ours, and I said he wishes that you knew as little about Brazilian integralism as he does. Which, first of all, no one knows anything about Brazilian integralism except apparently the two of us and anyone who's read the book. You officially know more than all of Brazil, right? This stuff's all in the past for them. They don't think about it at all. But yeah, so Vance is very much still part of this. He's still very much the vanguard, and the stakes are higher now that Orban is out of office, and he's not as popular. He's not as popular as they hoped. Right now, momentum seems to be behind Rubio. The Iran stuff has fallen apart for Vance, and Ken Griffin just publicly stated he preferred Rubio over Vance, which is bad news for fundraising.
I'm by no means saying that, if you're the current vice president, you aren't in an enviable position as far as trying to become president. But he's got, it's not a given that but it's very rare in our history for the vice president to go on to become president. And usually it's only when everyone agrees the president has done a pretty bang-up job, which I don't think we have universal agreement on this one. But there's so many threads in this conversation. I hope the listener's head isn't spinning too much. I like these sort of things, but just to do a little bit more backtracking and level setting, I do want to return to the anti-Semitism point because I think it's a good one to thread throughout the entire book. I also want to get back to it because it's one of those things that I think a normal person listening to this conversation can say, well, these two crackpots are just going off on, it's like, no, this is actually true. This is actually this ugly when you dig into it. You're not using hyperbole. But before we get there, let's go to Viktor Orban in Hungary. Viktor Orban, former leader of Hungary, was relatively recently ousted, and I know he'd served for what, 10, 12, 14 years or something to that.
Yeah,
He's
he was
for a
12.
while.
It was 16 his last term. It was since
Oh, it was
he had
16.
one way long ago, and then last 16 he was ruling.
Okay, gotcha. I know that the Orban government funded in a lot of ways the is it the Danube Institute, I believe. Rod Dreher, of course, associated with that. I actually had one of the institutes. I had one of them on as a guest once. Wonderful guest. Had a good conversation with him. It wasn't until kind of after I invited, and not that I wouldn't have had a conversation with him, but if I'd have known now then what I know now, I might have asked him more pointed questions about Orban's regime. We did talk about it briefly, but I wasn't ready to do that whole song and dance. So he gave a very similar response to Rod Dreher of, didn't exactly endorse Orban, but certainly was far more willing to give him the benefit of the doubt in a lot of areas. Like, huh? That seems odd. But at any rate, I guess kind of as an opening, maybe not so much a question, but help our listeners understand the degree to which Hungary's government played a role in post-liberalism here in the West, and particularly the United States. And I guess wrapped into that, why did Hungary care? Why was it their prerogative so much to try to influence this small group in the U.S.? What were they hoping to get out of this?
So I read an article in Providence called The Grand Budapest Cartel, as a joke, the title on Grand Budapest Hotel, the movie. And where I laid this out. So Orban received a fair amount of tax money from an otherwise very poor country. Hungary is, and not a very religious country. Hungary's kind of in trouble financially, and in terms of its population, it tends to experience a heavy amount of brain drain into Germany and Poland, where just places where there's more economic opportunity. And so not the first place you would think to look as an alternative to the American constitutional order. But the thing that Orban did was he heavily invested in conservative intellectuals in the United States, and to a lesser degree in Great Britain. Now, the thing about doing that is that it is not expensive, because conservative intellectuals are usually underemployed and desperate for recognition. uh if you look at the amount of money that's offered by the Ford Foundation to progressives, you can look at MacArthur Foundation, just hundreds of thousands of dollars going out to professors on the left that are teaching at Cornell or Harvard or prestigious universities. And so it was easy pickings for him. It was and the thing about academics is not only are they cheap dates, but they're also a deal, because all you have to do is you fly them out first class, you show them the city the Habsburgs built, give them an audience that'll laugh at their jokes, and a nice check to help them pay the mortgage, send them back, and they will write in favor of you forever. And it's because finally someone has taken me seriously. Finally, I've gotten some recognition. I got to see this place. And so the value proposition of something like the Danube Institute, the Hungarian Institute of International Affairs, and there's a third one, Matthias Corvinus Collegium, that was the other one. These three institutions was very easy for Hungary to influence the change in the right. And so post-liberalism was actually an attempt to modify American conservatism away from interventionism, free market economics, and a kind of religious liberty-based social conservatism, to one of multipolarity, in which Russia and China get their spheres of influence, independent of American interference, a state-managed economy, and a kind of state-managed religious regime instead of there being religious liberty. And the reason that Hungary likes this is that they're very close to to Russia and China. They have very close relationship to Russia. Russia's developed a lot of their energy and nuclear fields. They get a ton of their oil from Russia. China has operations and manufacturing in Hungary. The Chinese nationals that are there are actually independent from Hungary's laws. They don't have to actually obey Hungarian laws as long as it's within reason. And so they have a lot of economic stakes in these countries. And so part of what Orban had to do was essentially do a quid pro quo, where he was the burr in the saddle of NATO. And it wasn't exactly concealed. By the end of Orban's regime, and Peter Magyar was obviously going to win, that we started to hear leaks about how what did he want to he was going to be the mouse to Putin's lion, and he was directly feeding his intelligence from NATO to Russia during NATO meetings. The Hungarian representative to NATO was doing that. It was very obviously happening by the end. And the biggest moment for all of this was the organization that Papin was president of, one of the post-liberals we talk about in the book, had a Russian agent in it that was doing sort of influence work. And the Hungarian counterespionage office said to Orban that this was the case, and he declined to do anything about it, just left the guy alone to do his job. And he wasn't removed until after Orban left office. The guy got out of there. I mean, he got out of there real fast after that. So, I'm just reporting stuff that's out there, I would certainly love to see more disclosures of what we know as influence campaigns go. But what this has meant as a result of years and years of Hungarian money influencing the right is that places like the Heritage Foundation had like an official relationship to talk about global affairs with the Danube Institute. And we had seen a number of conservative scholars filter through those organizations and then start to advocate for like the Hungarian family policy, which was one of the things they were pushing for a long time until the evidence showed that it didn't work, undeniably. So if you've ever wondered like why suddenly a person is a big fan of Hungary, it's probably because they got swanned about Budapest and had some goulash and shook hands with smiling Europeans.
Another thing we kind of knew is that Peter Magyar mentioned something about the state funding the CPAC in America, and they had the CPAC in Hungary or whatever at one point.
And they funded National Conservative Conference in Brussels. Like, yeah, it has been an influence campaign, and it sounds a little tinfoil hat, but it's just like, it's not like they concealed this, right? Again, this was stuff that was just reported in the newspaper.
Yeah. Well, I mean, Peter Magyar's since he's been elected, he's been tearing down a lot of it. They just announced the other day that the state TV put out a thing apologizing for the propaganda and that they had on state television for the last several years or whatever.
So do you think, Thomas, it's too late for me to try to get in on this?
Oh no, yeah.
Okay.
Phil Magnus calls it the goulash train. It's been dried off.
Okay. Dang it.
It's left the station.
I like my principles, but I occasionally mention, if the price is right, I might be willing to sell out, but nobody's made an offer so far, so I'll hang on to my integrity for now.
Yeah. Well, now's the time not to sell out, because a lot of the places to sell out are going to be going under. So.
Yeah. Well,
That's right.
I missed my chance. Well, hey, so this is disjointed from what we're talking about, but let me return then to the anti-Semitic ideas. Talk to me about, historically speaking, and I'm quoting not exactly, but close to quote from the book here, that historically speaking, there was this view that the French throne and altar did not fall because of their own failures, but because of a conspiracy of shadowy actors, including Freemasons, the Illuminati, Enlightenment thinkers, and many others. It doesn't mention the Jews in that particular regard, but I think throughout your book you kind of mention that. And I find the statement just so bafflingly absurd that the throne and altar fell for these shadowy reasons, when it's like, if you know just even the least a bit about the French Revolution, the amount of stupidity leading up to that and the mismanagement, uh, it's not a conspiracy. It was very evident what happened. And the idea that, I mean, but we see this all the time, right? 9/11 or the 2020 elections, we have to have some grand conspiratorial excuse instead of just accepting the facts on the ground. But all that being said, and again, the Jews were not mentioned there, and maybe we could wed this to both the Jews and the Freemasons. What is the connection then between this sort of, I guess we'll call it, in between the French Revolution and World War I era, the origins of the or rather the conspiracy theories attributed to a lot of what went wrong in Catholicism?
This was one of the weirdest chapters. I principally wrote that chapter, and it was one of the weirdest things I ever had to endure writing. Um, when I was at Ave Maria University, which is a very mission-driven Catholic liberal arts college down in South Florida, I would occasionally get students that would ask me if it was true that the American Constitution was primarily a Masonic document. And I at first had no idea what Masonic meant. Like, I am so absolutely normal in my in my comportment of my religion, that the idea that things would be Masonic was just not on my radar. There might be some listeners who are in the lodge, or have like parents or grandparents, or I guess fathers or grandfathers that were Freemasons, and not normally associated with what I'm about to describe, but this really does capture the kind of brain poisoning that the French Revolution left among the most conspiracy-minded figures opposed to the revolution. So there was a Jesuit priest named Abbe Baruel. I did not learn French, so I do not say the French right, and I apologize. When I get to any German names, I'll land those like a, you know, um,
This is a safe
experience.
place. I
Yeah,
don't do well with my French
an
pronunciations.
experienced pilot. But so he wrote this very long, and ended up being like, I think, 4-volume account of the reasons for the called the History of Jacobinism. And he explains that the reason that the French Revolution succeeded wasn't because the church had very bad people in it that were doing things to undermine the people's faith in the Catholic Church, or very corrupt people in the monarchy. Rather, it was because that there was like the shadowy figures on the outside that were either driving the church to do bad things, or the altar to do bad. I'm sorry, the throne or altar to do bad things, or lied. Right, they just lied about these things didn't actually happen, and so he assigns blame to like the Illuminati and to the Freemasons and to a bunch of like very specific sort of esoteric figures. And the idea is that this otherwise perfect regime was undermined by foreign influence. And this is a classic case of a modern conspiracy theory. And in fact, Burrell is like one of the originators of modern conspiracy theory in this way, right? The idea of you can't trust your senses. There's something afoot here that goes deeper. Now, he, late in life, near death, actually receives a letter called the Simonini letter, Simonini, or I've always forget how to pronounce it, which actually ties a lot of this stuff to Jewish Kabbalism of Florence, Italy. And he doesn't publish it, but it gets published later. And that's where the idea of Masonic and Jewish undermining join. So you end up with what's called the Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory. And the person who really advances the anti-Semitism is a guy named Louis de Bunald. Uh, Under French Revolution, Jews were emancipated. Prior to the revolution, Jews in France actually were pretty constrained about what they were allowed to do. Considering, broadly in Europe, the conditions for Jews was pretty good, but it was still very limited. There were certain trades they couldn't practice. They obviously couldn't participate in a number of like public offices. They couldn't own land in most cases. They were repeatedly harassed because, as is still the case today, there is a sort of history of rabbinical debates called the Talmud, And in those debates, a few of the rabbis say nasty things about Jesus. And so this becomes the basis for pogroms, right? It's like they've got the Talmud in there, and it's like, the Talmud, we have the Talmud. What,
Yeah.
I didn't even know we had a Talmud, right? Like nobody cares, right? Like it's you either engage in Talmudic disputes or you don't, but it's not really like a fixture of Judaism the way a lot of anti-Semites try to emphasize. And so, in the French Revolution, Jews are emancipated from all these rules. And historically, Jews had done jobs that were forbidden to Catholics, and that would include things like banking. And a lot of the Alsatian nobility had mismanaged their money and were therefore in debt to Jews. And now the newly emancipated Jews were, having to foreclose on these ancient French estates in Alsace because these these aristocrats weren't used to dealing with money, and as a result, we're kind of blowing the family name and fortune. And Bonald is terrified of this because he sees this as the first real step away from traditional roles of the landed gentry as Christian leaders toward the new men like the Jews being loyal only to themselves and to money, and using that to place France under their rule. And so by the time Bonald and Berulle, their ideas kind of marry in the mid 19th century, that Judeo-Masonic conspiracy theory is just taken as the explanation by what we call reactionary political thinkers whenever there's any kind of disagreement over the degree to which a Republican government should surface in the continent. The answer from the right on the continent is always these people must be Jews or Freemasons. So the conspiracy theory operates as an explanation for why monarchies failed, and then later, once it becomes impossible to really believe that you can recreate these monarchies, this is after the First World War, it becomes kind of an excuse to engage in authoritarian politics, which is that that regular parliamentary republics are so prone to the undermining of different conspiratorial groups that it requires an authentic voice of like a Catholic Spanish man or a Catholic Croatian to defeat the groups. And then of course also permission, it becomes the basis for a collaboration with fascist and Nazi regimes for the participating in the Shoah.
There is just way too much where I'm having to try to pack in this single conversation. I feel like I'm doing an injustice and I keep skipping centuries here. But I want to ask you if we were, in theory, we could have a lot of this conversation on, say, a very left of center podcast by two guys who had written a book and are essentially taking a let's call it Jacobin position. Right, that they're pitting themselves against these reactionary forces that ultimately get intertwined with fascists, with the Nazis, with authoritarian right-wing regimes. You guys are not Jacobins. I wouldn't describe you as a leftist. How do you see, where does, and maybe part of the problem is, I know when we say conservatism, when we're talking about European versus American, those are two sometimes very different things. But how would you depict that struggle if we're not, is it more complex than just the reactionaries versus the Jacobins, the liberals in that sense versus the illiberals? Where does a conservative friendly view squeeze into this entire dynamic?
Well, the American conservatism, or the sort of any political position or movement in the U.S. that is friendly with American founding, supports constitutional democracy, religious freedom, the Bill of Rights, all that stuff, which is very mainstream in the United States, whether you're conservative or a liberal, doesn't really fit in well with either the Jacobins or the reactionaries in continental Europe. We just don't. They're both kind of stuck. It's like two horseshoe ideologies. And actually, we were talking about anti-Semitism. The reactionaries had bad anti-Semitism problem, but so did the left wing. It was the anti-Semitism. There was a sliver of liberals, Republican liberals in continental Europe that were normies about this. But if you go too far to the left, to the Marxists or something, or the Jacobins, they also had an anti-Semitism problem. So it wasn't, I mean, it's kind of like today. I mean, you have the horseshoe theory thing happening today with the radicals on the left and the right. All they can agree on is that America sucks, and so do the Jews. That's what they agree on. So I mean, that's it goes way back. But James and I are American conservatives, but that's not. But American conservatism should reject right-wing European reactionary thought. It's just disgusting and gross and fascist. We fought a war to fight those people.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah, the way that that I've often joked about it being is like a problem with the conservative in the United States is that we weren't conquered by Napoleon, right? Like Napoleon is like one of the figures that sort of haunts the text. The continent is inundated with the French Revolution and by way of Napoleon's conquest into the French Empire, and the outcome of Napoleon is just ruinous on the continent. Like Spain is broke and dysfunctional. You know, you have the unification of Italy, but it's very bitter, and you know, you have the rise of these different regional powers. The Habsburgs are in rapid decline. So are the Turks, and it's just so hard for a lot of these countries to understand what just happened, and so they look to these theories, and so does the church. Like there are a lot of uh you know there are a lot of Catholic cardinals and even a couple popes that cannot wrap their brain around such a massive destructive change to the continent, that they start to entertain these conspiracy theories that lead ultimately to the attempts to institute governments based on them in the years after the First World War, like in Spain, Austria, and the like. And they engage in all kinds of violence against the left. Like, in fact, like that's what precipitates a lot of these fascist regimes. Like the reason that Dolphus shells a bunch of apartment complexes with Australian artillery is because that's where a lot of the organized social democrats were, and they were doing a worker strike against his government. And this remains kind of in contemporary politics a constant rhetorical appeal, which is, if we have enemies to the right, but the left has no enemies to the left, then they're more united and therefore will defeat us. And so that means Mitt Romney needs to let Nick Fuentes in.
Which just incidentally, I'm sorry, I always feel like I have to interject. That argument never works in that direction. It's never Nick Fuentes needs to let Mitt Romney in. It's always Romney needs to let Mick Fuentes in.
Yeah.
Yeah,
It's because the people who say that actually
call.
agree with the reactionaries.
Yes.
And they're more afraid to say it out loud. They're trying to normalize them.
That's exactly right.
Sorry, I interrupted your train of thought. Did you have more there, James?
No, not much. Just to say that this sort of way of thinking remains part of the way some of these figures think. Like Roger Ver likes to talk about Weimar America, right? And so the America's the 1930s is actually like a preoccupation among not just conservative elites, but sort of general elites, right? There's this sense that we're ideologically polarized in a way that will lead to a kind of destructive civil war or some kind of dictatorship. And this is a real go outside moment, right? This is not actually how most people are, but it is how most elites are. And so it remains a very real danger, even though an elite civil war doesn't quite look the same as, like, the Reichstag fire or the Spanish Civil War.
So, like I said, there's so many threads I could still pull on. There's so many angles we haven't covered yet. I wanted to ask, Thomas, I appreciate you saying that you're American conservatives, right? So, we're rooting things in this. I know Jonah Goldberg talks often about how conservatism in the United States context, anyways, is more than liberalism, but a conservatism that doesn't conserve liberalism isn't a conservatism worth having in effect. These things can be distinguished from each other, but there is some sort of an intertwining. I'm curious though, as we're kind of wrapping the conversation up, the degree to which the post liberals would have let's shelf their arguments for a moment, and let's look rather at sort of the idea of momentum or energy. And maybe this is wrong, but certainly among the youth it seems like they're having a moment, in the nat cons are having a moment, the integralists, the post liberals. Some of it could be, as you had mentioned, among the elites online, so maybe it's hard to know what actual audience capture this has. And I guess I'm asking both of you, but I want to start with you, Thomas, because you're one of the many hats you wear, of course, is with the Reagan caucus. Reagan was 40 years ago. I think all three of us on this call probably have very similar politics, but this is something I'm often asked is like, aren't you guys sort of dinosaurs at this point? Isn't that the dead consensus? Hasn't the nation moved on? And heck, maybe if the post liberals aren't right, okay, maybe I can agree with you, about all your criticisms of them. But aren't they speaking to problems that you guys have failed to speak to? Because if you hadn't failed to, then why do we end up in this place in the first place? Why did we end up with a Donald Trump if everything was fine on the right, if you will? And so I guess I'm just kind of curious, what is your overall hope in terms of the future as far as capturing I'll call it a Reagan-friendly, because I think you would be okay with the term, a Reagan-friendly conservatism? Does it have salience and purchase among the youth of today? And if not, why not? And what should we be doing about that?
Well, we shouldn't cater to the youth. They don't even vote, and they're a bunch of idiots, and they still need to grow up. Right? So everyone just needs to shut up about that, right? Most of the people
Suddenly
who
someone
vote
else
are
is the bad cop.
But yeah, most of the people who vote are not these people, and so we really need to focus on educating these people while we still can, rather than just catering everything to what they think. Second of all, most of this stuff is actually very popular. Reaganism is actually very popular as far as like the median voter in a general election. Most people get to the general election are like, this sucks. Why do we have these crappy choices? Why can't we have somebody like Reagan, right? If you actually put a Reagan there, he would do very well. The problem is that the primary electorate is a smaller electorate and it's more radicalized, right? And it's hard to get somebody like that through that electorate. But a lot of it's just vibes, right? That even that electorate, if you ask them their actual policy preferences, a lot of times it does actually still look a lot of times like Reagan. It's like but they also like the sort of vibe thing that he's our guy and he's represents our tribe, and somehow you need to get somebody who's able to capture that vibe and have better view of government and policy. I mean, there's some hope that Rubio is going to actually win out the primary. I mean, the people in the Republican primary voters actually kind of like Rubio. He's kind of figuring out how to attract that crowd. But I mean, it's not over with, and we should not be catering to these young people that don't even vote. They just sit in their rooms and I don't even want to talk about what they do in their rooms, right? Like that's not the people that we should be. I mean, I'm sorry, I like a lot of these young guys or whatever. I feel bad for them though. There are some bad things there. I mean, they're so polarized. These young people are so polarized with the men and the women. The women are over here and the men are over here. They don't talk to each other. They don't date that much. The women tend to be pretty progressive and the men tend to be pretty reactionary, and it sucks for them. And I think the responsible thing to do as your older person dealing with them is be like, listen, you got to get yourself marriageable, because one of the things that biggest problems is they're not getting married, and that you need. But you get married, you can't just complain all the time, right? You actually have to go and you have to make yourself marriageable. And I think that if they did that, more of them did that, then a lot more of the women would want to marry them, and then we could solve some of these issues, I think. But yeah, we should not listen to them about their politics. They don't know what they're talking about. They don't even read books. They're barely literate. I mean, sorry, it's just not. I I love these people, but no, we shouldn't listen to them. Sorry.
The whole point of the book is to kind of furnish people with an historical understanding to communicate to these people. I mean, Archbishop Cordileone actually even encourages young people to take a look at the book, because these crazy conspiracy theories of the 19th and early 20th century led to regimes that post-liberals like exalt, right? There's like Franco Fridays with Jack Posobiec, and these regimes like starved people and were poor and committed genocides, and they're like, but it's really just like a kind of like right-wing religious identity politics. essentially, like, they got called all these bad names by the left, and then they decided just to be those things that they were called, right? To be Nazis, to be fascists, and to celebrate Franco because he was particularly despised by the left. And this kind of immaturity, as Tom says, is kind of a product of the failure to grow up. But it's a serious problem all the same, because they seem to be highly distortive in terms of what people want, and there's a mirror image of it on the left with, like, the politics that we see the DSA pulling off in New York City, where they can imagine a kind of alternative because they discourse about it. They do online discourse, but this is a problem of very little experience in real governing. And that's when this sort of analogy to the 1930s starts to feel like it's got more traction to it, because one of the features of a lot of these post-liberal governments was how little experience they actually had in governing. And they had a lot of, like, experience in doing ideological discourse, but when it comes to making hard decisions, what they ultimately decided on was based on what the army could force.
Yeah, and they would recruit these paramilitaries based with a bunch of young, resentful men, and that's what I mean. That's the danger, is that you get demagogues come through. People who say, like, a demagogue, for instance, who says, "Hey, I don't agree with Nick Fuentes, but I care about his followers." One of maybe a recent politician said something like that, and, like, yeah, that's what he's up. I mean, that's where I think he's dangerous. He's thinking in terms of that. He wants to create he wants to create a paramilitary almost of loyalists from these resentful young men. And instead, we should be saying, hey, to the resentful young men, we say, you got to. Jordan Peterson actually had a much better approach. He said, you got to clean your room. You got to get a job. You got to make yourself marriageable. Those are the things that they need to learn. Not this. I mean, a lot of stuff with the policy stuff too. If you think of the actual areas where we need policy work, you need entitlement reform. You need to do something about how it's impossible to buy a house right now. You got to do things like that, right? Most of the solutions to these policy issues are really boring things that they do at the American Enterprise Institute. Like, that's mostly the well thought out policy stuff. There's no well thought out policy stuff coming from J.D. Vance or his crowd. They don't know how anything works. They just know how to complain with everybody else.
My utopia would be a nation in which politics is really, really boring. Someday maybe we can get there. But anyhow, gentlemen, it has been a pleasure. The book, Why Post-Liberalism Failed, by James Patterson, not to be confused with the other James Patterson, and Thomas Howes. Buy it. If you're a young person listening to this, buy it and read it to prove Thomas wrong. But it's like I said, it's well written. We barely scratched the surface. There's a lot of history in this book that we just didn't have a chance to talk about. Gentlemen, thank you so much for enlightening us on this most interesting and a little gruesome topic. Thank you for taking time to come on the show.
Thank you so much, Josh.
Thanks for listening to the Saving Elephants podcast. Be sure and subscribe for future episodes. Do you have a topic or question about conservatism, millennials, the Republican Party, or anything else that you'd like us to cover in a future podcast? We would love to hear from you. Email us at savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. That is savingelefantsblog@gmail.com. You can find us on Facebook, Twitter, and catch our weekly Friday blog posts at savingelefantsblog.com. That is savingelefantsblog.com. Join us next time as we reignite conservatism for millennials.